All right, thanks everyone. My name is Dave Van Riper. I'm here to talk about something that's much more contemporary than the historical talks we've seen thus far, but there is a little bit of history that I'm going to start with here. So I'm a geographer by training and do a lot of work with decennial census data, both historical and contemporary. And in the most recent set of 2020 census data, the Census Bureau made a massive change in how they protect the privacy of respondents. And that massive change is going to have an impact for all of us who make maps based on those demographic data. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what this new change is and how it might impact your job as a cartographer. So the Census Bureau has used three main sources of disclosure avoidance to protect privacy over the years. So before 1990, the Census Bureau typically used suppression. So if a particular statistic was based on too small of a sample size, or if there weren't enough people who met a particular threshold, they would simply just not publish anything and just give you 3 dots in a table, and you wouldn't really have any way of knowing what those statistics were for those places to protect that privacy. So the drawback to suppression, of course, is you're missing data, right? You would like to know what that is, and so if you're doing analysis on that geographic area, trying to make a map, it's going to be a hole in your map, or you're going to be missing data for doing that analysis. In 1990, the Census Bureau kind of decided that suppression was not really a useful way of doing that, mostly from the missing data problem. So what they decided to do was called swapping. So what they would do in swapping is they would take a household that they identified as being at risk of disclosure, and they would find a similar household somewhere else within the state. So households were never swapped across state boundaries. They'd find a household that had the same size, and they would try to match on some different characteristics. They might try to match on the race of the head of household. They might try to match on the family structure within that household. But of course, they couldn't get a perfect match all the time, right? So the yellow dot there is my house, right? So you'd have a 3-person household with a white, non-Hispanic male who was 43 at the time of the 2020 census. And I have a spouse and I have a child. They would try to find a similar household nearby, and they would simply swap our records, right? And so that introduces some noise and some kind of plausible deniability into an attacker's ability to reconstruct the data and find out more about me. So they used that in 1990 through 2010, and that seemed to work until the middle of the last decade. The Census Bureau undertook a massive reconstruction and re-identification attack to see whether or not the swapping mechanism would kind of fundamentally protect the privacy of census respondents. Now, I've usually given an hour for this talk, so we can go into a lot of detail about how this works. But in general, this particular reconstruction and re-identification attack resulted in the following findings. The Census Bureau was able to take published decennial counts, so data that came out in 2010, at the block and tract level. They reconstructed 308 million individual records from the data. So they were able to take counts by block and make individual people, and they would assign an age, a sex, a race, a Hispanic ethnicity to each of those individuals. And they knew the block where that person lived. They then linked those 308 million records onto some commercial data that they had purchased to support the operations of the 2010 census. They were able to link 139 million of those 308 million records to the commercial data set on, like I said, on block, age, and sex. In this case, they didn't use race, they just used block, age, and sex. They then, because of the Census Bureau, they can link those 139 million people onto this confidential data that they have in-house. So they take those links behind the firewall and they link these commercial records to the confidential data on block, age, and sex again. And because they have the names from both the commercial data set and the confidential data, they can figure out how many of those people they've identified, right? So they have these putative matches in the commercial to reconstructed data. They can then confirm those putative matches behind the firewall. And they claim to have identified 52 million individual respondents correctly. Now, of course, they have access to those names, so they know they've got that identification right. We as external people don't know that. We don't have access to those confidential responses. But let's just say that this match rate of 52 million people, or 17% of the population, shocked the Census Bureau and pushed them to develop a brand new disclosure avoidance technique for the 2020 census. The findings here are that the traditional disclosure avoidance techniques do not satisfy Title 13 privacy protections, pushing the Bureau to adopt new techniques. And they decided to adopt new techniques based on a concept that comes out of computer science and out of cryptography called differential privacy. Differential privacy is effectively an accounting mechanism that allows you to keep track of how much information about you is leaked every time a statistic is published, right? So the minute that the Census Bureau publishes there's 330 million people in the US, the fact that you're in the US is leaked, right? Now, that's not a particularly disclosive fact about you, but that bit of information is a leak, and this concept of differential privacy allows you to account for all of these leaks as you publish demography statistics, right? Counts of people by sex, by age, by sex, by age, for the nation, the state, the county, the census tract, and the block. And this differential privacy framework allows you to keep track of that. So rather than bore you all with the math behind it, let's use an example to show you how this is kind of implemented. So essentially, to protect privacy, what you do is you inject random noise into the statistics. And if you've changed that count, then if you reconstruct the information, you're not going to reconstruct the exact population. So what does that look like in practice? So let's say I've done a survey of 100 people, and I've asked those people to tell me what their sex is and what their school attendance is. And the sex variable has two responses, male or female. The school attendance variable has three responses: whether you've never attended school, whether you're currently attending school, and whether you attended school in the past. I can take the survey responses from these 100 individuals, and I can construct a 3x2 contingency table, right? I just count up all the combinations of the statistics, and so we can create the cross tabulations from this, and you can see there's 4 females who've never attended school, 31 females who attended school in the past. Now, to make these data differentially private, what we do is we draw a statistical distribution, and there's lots of ways to do this, and you draw a random value from that statistical distribution, and then that is your noise value that you then apply to a cell in that crosstab. And the key thing to know about this is that the spread, the width of that distribution controls the magnitude of the noise that's injected into those counts. So the narrower that statistical distribution is, the smaller the noise values are, which means that the published data would be more accurate. The wider that distribution is, the higher chance you have of drawing a large noise value, making the data less accurate. Less accurate data, more privacy protecting. More accurate data, less privacy protecting. And you have to try to figure out what's the sweet spot as you set that up. So in this case, we're using a Laplace distribution. We draw these random values. We add them to the cells. And you see in a number of cases, the noise doesn't really impact the counts very much. So we've added 8 people to our survey. We got 108 respondents. Most of the time, the noise values are 1 or 2, right? The Laplace distribution has a peak around 0, except females, never attended school. We've tripled that count, gone from 4 to 12. So here's a case where you're like, okay, I've got this this noise injection, and what do I do with that, right? How do I know how to interpret that statistic now? The nice thing about differential privacy is the parameters used to draw that particular distribution are public. The Census Bureau can tell us these are the parameters used, and this is what the distributions we drew the noise from. We can try to then back out the error involved. So if you've ever done anything with the American Community Survey, you know they have the concept of margins of error. Essentially, that type of thing can be done for the decennial census. If they had more time, we'd talk about how it doesn't quite work that way because they have to do a ton of post-processing of this data because you can see that there's negative values here. It's pretty easy to go below 0, right? You can have a count of -2. Well, in a census, counts of -2 don't really mean much, and policymakers would freak out if those statistics came out in published data. So they have to do a lot of post-processing to eliminate all of those negative counts, which means you've got to then do all kinds of adjustments to the other counts to make that work, which makes the math for the uncertainty a little bit less straightforward. But nonetheless, this is the kind of world we're working under for 2020 decennial, and they plan to introduce similar methods for the American Community Survey in the future. Now, the key thing I want to talk about next is that these decisions are not made by a computer. They have to be decided on by people, right? And so people at the Census Bureau have to decide how much noise do I want to inject for particular geographic levels, for particular demographic characteristics. Is age important to protect? Is sex important to protect? Is the household structure important to protect? All of those decisions have to be made by people, and as you might imagine, there's a whole lot of trade-offs that are involved in that, right? And so there's a committee at the Census Bureau that are making these decisions. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if we see something come out next week about some policy parameters they're going to decide on. But essentially, these decisions are going to have real-world impacts for us as data users. So what are these policy decisions that they have to make? There's really two main things they have to deal with. So one, they have to decide how accurate or inaccurate to make different data for different geographic levels, right? So at the nation level, the state level, the county level, the Bureau can decide if they want to make data more or less accurate, depending on the sensitivity of those geographic units. So this is the allocation that the Bureau has decided upon for a recent demonstration data product that came out. And essentially, the way to interpret these fractions is the larger the percentages, the larger the percentage, the more accurate those statistics are. The lower the percentage, the less accurate those are going to be. And if you can see, and it should jump off the page at you, block data are incredibly disclosive from a privacy perspective. So the Census Bureau is going to make block data more inaccurate. They're going to inject more noise into those in order to protect people's privacy. But they're going to, as you can see, make data like counties and census tracts get a larger fraction, and so they're going to be more accurate. And then there's a whole lot of other bits that go into this algorithm, but essentially the Bureau has made the decision that blocks are going to be less accurate and higher geographic levels will be more accurate. So if you're going to use block data in the future for mapping or in your projects, just know that some of those counts that you're going to observe are probably not going to be particularly accurate or useful for doing mapping. The other thing that the Census Bureau has to decide on is the demographic characteristics. And there's a lot of numbers on this slide. Don't worry about the actual magnitudes necessarily, but you can see here that there's a lot of different queries that the Bureau has to work with. So the big one, so Hispanic by sex. That's just Hispanic or not Hispanic by male, female, right? There's 4 cells in that cross tabulation. And the Bureau has to decide, is it important to keep those statistics more accurate or less accurate? And again, the higher the fraction, the higher the percentage, the less noise injected. The lower the fraction, the more noise that's injected. Again, you can see here that the Bureau has decided that the block level statistics get very small fractions, and that those data are going to be less well protected for kind of all of the different demographic characteristics that we typically use in the census. So what does that mean for you as a cartographer going forward? Well, there's a couple of examples here. Lauren Griffin did a project a couple of years ago using some demonstration data looking at hotspots of persons age 65 and over in San Diego County. On the left-hand side, those are hotspots delineated from the published 2010 data. On the right side, those are data derived from the differentially private data. And it's a little tricky to see, but the hotspot sizes and locations vary a little bit. It's not a crazy amount of difference, but these are the types of things that might pop up going forward. It's a little hard to see. There's a story map that you can look at that shows you these off. But the other thing that you're going to see is that the counts are going to vary. And again, this is a little small, but this is the town I grew up in South Dakota. And in my hometown in 2010, there were 353 people identifying as 2 or more races, and in the differentially private data, there's 305 individuals identifying as 2 or more races. That's a 50 odd person difference, which if you're going to develop some policies to reach out to various sub-communities, that 50 person difference might make an impact on what you're doing. Now, this is a pretty big city, right? I mean, big city, right? In South Dakota terms, it's a big city. But if we look at a smaller town, so Bruce is a town that's just outside of Brookings. There's only about 200 people in Bruce. In 2010, there was 195 whites and 4 2 or more races. In the differentially private data, again, these are small counts, but the number of persons identifying as 2 or more races quadruples from 4 to 16. So on a relative basis, you've got this increase, and that's the key thing to take into account here. For small subgroups, we're going to have the noise injection is going to be relatively more impactful, right? It's going to mess with those counts more. If you're working on a place like the city of Minneapolis or Hennepin County, that noise injection is not going to make a huge difference. But for smaller cities and smaller places, it's going to be important. So as you make maps analyzing these places, it's going to kind of probably want to deal with some of that uncertainty. So what do you need to do? Communicate that uncertainty. It's not just for the ACS anymore. We're going to have to deal with this for the decennial data going forward. And then the other key thing is to learn which geo units and which tables or demographic characteristics contain the most uncertainty, right? So if you're going to look at single year of age, by sex, by race, at the tract level, just know that those are going to be pretty uncertain. If you're dealing with total population at the tract level, you're going to get pretty good counts out of this particular algorithm. And then just to leave you, we at IPUMS have done a ton of work trying to make this understandable for the general data user community. So we have a lot of demonstration data products we've processed for people, lots of videos, longer versions of this talk and whatnot. So thank you very much.